Let's get started in integrating PayPal Advanced Checkout. To begin, I'll navigate to our Developer Studio at developer.paypal.com and hover over Docs, click on Online, go to Checkout, Advanced, and we can click on Integrate. This is our latest Developer Studio that enhances the way you use our advanced credit and debit card docs, as well as other sections, and you can view our other video that runs through a demo of how to use these interactive options. For this video guide, I have used the Node.js project given here and downloaded it by clicking on this button. The project will give you the bare bones working demo with no frills. What I've done is changed a bit of the front-end styling so that it looks like a small website to purchase something, and I will explain what that code is doing. This project code that I am about to run through is not meant for direct production use, and the code along with this video guide is merely a means for developers to get started in learning how to implement our card processing option and adapt it to your existing website or projects. A production PayPal account doesn't have this advanced credit and debit card feature enabled by default. It is an onboarding process that one must apply for and perhaps wait a few days for vetting to be approved. But you can enable this feature in your Sandbox REST app that you created. Let's take a look at the code. The project files downloaded from the Developer Studio remain largely unchanged, but you will see this dist folder with the files inside. The app.js remains the same, but I created the checkout.html file, and the rest of the files, for the most part, remain unchanged. These files inside of the dist folder are the front-end files, and you will find the server-side files in the server directory. Make sure to rename this file to simply be .env, and also insert your PayPal client ID and secret in here. There is another location that will be in the checkout.html file where you will also need to add the same client ID, and I'll show you that in a moment. If you go through the Get Started section on the Dev Docs and scroll to the Set Up Your Development, you will see everything that this project uses. Your website may not use Node, but our server side is simply calling REST API calls. So by going to the Integrate section of our Dev Docs, you can change the language code of the project downloadable, as well as you are able to call the same endpoints using your preferred server-side coding language if it's not listed here. Let's begin with the checkout.html file. At the very top, you will need to add your client ID here in the PayPal SDK script. If we scroll down to the body, I have the product title here, the amount displayed, an image, and all the payment options inside this div. The important part for how our SDK renders these card forms is that you must provide a placeholder divs that will house the credit card fields. Each div must have an identifier that you can provide our SDK, so here are mine. I've also added a real input element, not a div placeholder, but a real input that asks for other information that isn't sensitive card data, such as billing fields and shipping fields. Here I also include PayPal standard checkout buttons as payment options, but I won't go over these in this video. We have a video on explaining how to integrate PayPal standard already if you wish to learn about these. And lastly, we have a submit input element here where we will listen to it being clicked and run our process. How about we see how this actually looks like on the browser? So here it is. We see that we've added the card fields directly under the main picture. The billing fields and shipping fields are hidden to save on vertical space. And here are the PayPal buttons and our final submit button below. Let me give you a quick demo on what it will do. So I will enter Sandbox information for the card here, the expiration date, just any date in the future, and the security code digits. Then I'll fill out these billing fields quickly. I'll fast forward a bit for you. And shipping. I added these fields here so you can see exactly how it can be used, but I have not implemented it in the server API calls. I will tell you where you would need to pass those shipping details in the code. Here I'm switching to the front-end JavaScript file called app.js, so this will run directly on the browser. The first part renders the PayPal buttons, and the card fields that we are focusing on in this video begin here. Let's declare the card fields function and store it in a variable here. We have some basic styling that you can decide on for the input fields, and we define the create order and onApprove functions. As you can see here, these two functions for our card fields are the same ones used for the PayPal buttons. So we will look at the details of these functions in a bit. Once we have that part set, we can see if this merchant is eligible to use this card field's code. That goes back to the comment that I made earlier about this advanced debit and credit card feature not being on by default in production PayPal accounts. If this code detects that the client ID being used for this merchant doesn't have this feature enabled, then you can make it so that certain parts of your code either don't run or display something different on the screen. If they are eligible, then each card field gets rendered on the page securely, and we initiate a listener to the submit button at the bottom that will run a .submit PayPal function that will securely tokenize the card data that was typed and associate it to the PayPal order that gets created in the create order function. This all happens behind the scenes once you run this .submit function. Let's take a look now at the details of said create order function to see what PayPal is doing there. So this is the function created that is placed on PayPal's config for create order. This is what will run as a callback. We are using fetch to run a network call to our server-side functions at this API/orders endpoint, and we are only passing a product ID and product quantity in the body. You, of course, can pass any and all variables that have to do with your website or project, but these are just placeholder examples here of what you can pass to fetch data behind the scenes later on, such as pricing and shipping options and all that stuff. This is where you would have to pass the values of each shipping input that I showed you a moment ago so that they can be used in our server-side API calls. Once we get the response, in this project code, if the ID exists, we assume the transaction is successful. Otherwise, we have error details presented in the API response, then we should handle those errors. It's very important to note that all data should always be sanitized and not be directly relayed from our server API responses straight to the browser. We don't want to expose unnecessary data unintentionally. If there is an error, we will update the result message here. The onApprove callback will send a network request in this fetch call to capture the approved order. You can certainly change this behavior, of course, and make the page redirect to a review page or whatever else your website currently does. But for this project file example, we are just capturing straight away, and we are passing the order ID in the same endpoint. Take note that not only do you not have to do it this way, but it's not recommended to have a direct endpoint that will simply serve as a relay from your server endpoint to PayPal's. You should have a process in place to validate and sanitize and perform internal logic. Since this is just a sandbox project example, we just show you how to pass the necessary info to your server and then make the PayPal capture call, which I will show the code for that in a moment. There are two types of successful transactions that you could perform: an authorization payment or go directly to a captured payment. Based on which ones you have set up, the API responses will differ with the word captures or authorizations in the response trail here. And similarly, if there was not a successful transaction, you will get error details here. Depending on which variable ended up getting stored, you can handle errors a few different ways, and here we show you the very basic way of handling it and saving an error message that you can display later on or however you need to. This final function is just a helper function to display our messages. Finally, let's take a look at the server-side code. Let's open the server.js file inside our server directory. Our default route, if anybody visits our root homepage, will load the checkout.html page shown here. Here we have a function to generate an access token, which will simply run another fetch network call to PayPal's REST API endpoint. No PayPal SDK being used here, so you can recreate this on your preferred language using REST APIs. As a reminder, you can also download the project file in our Dev Studio, just as I did for this one, and adjust the code yourself for learning purposes to eventually implement those learnings on your site. I want to skip down to the create order function, which is used in the create order callback on the front end that we already took a look at. You can see that we start our body payload here. It's a really simple payload of details of your order. We will pass this directly to PayPal's checkout orders API endpoint here. Remember that if you passed shipping details or any other details from the browser to your backend server, this is where you would continue to relay and pass them in this body payload. You can find the schema to this payload in our orders v2 REST API reference docs. This will then give the order ID to the browser, and it's called after somebody hits this endpoint of ours here. You can see we use the create order function. Now, here is the capture order function, and below below that is our route if it's called from the browser, as we saw a moment ago. The capture order function runs and we pass it directly to the PayPal endpoint to capture the order ID. Once again, just a reminder to implement your own internal sanitation of data and validation of information. This is just a basic example. Once we get the response from PayPal, we pass it to the browser. In this project file, you will also find functions and endpoints if you wanted to adjust your project to an authorized model instead of capturing it right away. So feel free to leverage these instead of the current ones if your business model authorizes a transaction first. Use this sandbox project to play around with our card processing solution until you adjust it to your use case. We have now successfully integrated PayPal Advanced Checkout.